The Dialed In Angling Podcast, presented by OnX Fish, Arneson's Rocky Point Resort, Strike Master, and 13 Fishing. Hey, welcome back to this week's podcast. It's hard to believe that we're nearing the end of August. I know next week there's some kids going back to school. I know in Wisconsin, I think they start school next week. Some parts of Minnesota down towards the Twin Cities. We have the state fair coming up next week. That's always kind of the official, unofficial end of summer, at least right before Labor Day weekend in Minnesota. We've got all of that going on. The game fair's already passed us. You know, all of this stuff goes quickly. Man, it feels like the 4th of July was just a week ago. And I know I've said that in past podcasts, but summer is flying right by like it always does in the upper Midwest. You know, nights are getting cooler. We're getting some rain, thankfully. So things are cooling off and things are happening, you know, this week alone. And in this podcast, I want to talk about a couple trips that I took this last week. One to Isle Royale. I want to talk in detail about that and using different baits and forward-facing sonar and discovery and everything I love doing. I did that with my son up there on Lake Superior. Very cool experience. You know, it's sort of a DIY type of deal. We didn't know what we were going to do. We just picked some really calm days to kind of do it. Now that we've explored, I'll kind of talk you through what I found out about that area and what I want to do next time I go up there, because we're already planning next year's event up there. It was such a fun event, so I'll get into that in a minute. Have done some walleye fishing this week with customers on Mille Lacs and also on a small lake. And then, of course, I've done a little bit of pan fishing with family, with friends. Just did a little fish fry with some friends and their kids, where I'm finding panfish locations on a lot of these lakes, because now that things are cooling off, we're getting a little bit of rain. Nighttime lows are getting in the 40s, upper 50s. Things are getting more towards fall. We're not obviously close to fall type of patterns yet, but these fish are going to start to stage up on the edges of these basins. They're still in the weed beds. I found out the hard way earlier this week, kind of looking for crappies out in a basin in an area. They weren't there. I looked and looked and looked. Lo and behold, a lot of these fish were along the weed lines. So I want to get into the talks about those particular bites that I've had over the last week. But I also want to touch a little bit in this podcast about forward-facing sonar. There's been some new forward-facing sonar units hitting the market. I want to touch on those. But I also want to talk about, you know, the benefits. You always hear the negatives of forward-facing sonar. You know, if you listen to this podcast, if you know me, I'm pro technology. I love using technology. I love using forward-facing sonar. I think, you know, obviously fishing with kids over the last few days, some buddies with friends, doing some panfish trips, to fishing Isle Royale with my son, utilizing technology to explore and to get on fish and to catch fish, or even to find fish that weren't biting. It's still fun to get out, and the exploratory aspect of forward-facing sonar is what I want to talk about and why I'm all for it. So before I get into that, let's touch on the Isle Royale trip that I did with my son. Robbie and I, you know, we've had this idea, you know, I've absolutely fallen in love with Lake Superior over the last year. I've been up there on numerous occasions, quite often, you know, not just trolling, but getting up there, casting for salmon, casting for lake trout, jigging for lake trout, just kind of exploring Lake Superior, basically from the South Shore all the way up the North Shore is what we've keyed in on this summer at various days, whether we get a flat, calm day, or I get a guide client cancellation, or we plan a trip. We've been doing a ton of Lake Superior fishing just because it's in our own backyard. And it's a lake that I've fished periodically over the last few years. You know, I've gone up with buddies trolling. My in-laws used to have a boat up there. We used to, you know, do various trolling with my brother-in-law, my wife, that sort of thing. But I never really had the passion for Lake Superior. I tend to fish Lake Michigan more often when I go salmon fishing, when I've gone with friends and various occasions. I probably fished more on Lake Michigan than I fished on Lake Superior, even though Lake Superior is in our own backyard, because in my mind, Lake Superior was sort of the Dead Sea compared to Lake Michigan. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not the case. being up on Lake Superior, what's cool about it is there's not a ton of boats out there. Yeah, there's some charters, but not compared to like Lake Michigan, for example. When you're out there, a lot of times you don't see many boats at all. You might see a few boats here and there, but they're very scattered about. I probably see less boats on Lake Superior on any given day than I do on Lake Mille Lacs. And so that puts it in perspective, even a weekday on Lake Mille Lacs, there's just not that many people out there. There's some people trolling, but I want to say this Lake Superior, renaissance for me anyway, started obviously with going out with Ethan Watashek from Lake Superior jigging. He just really opened my eyes to not just the jigging aspect of fishing lake trout on Superior, but just how many fish were out there. I'm just surprised to see on my graph, even on my 2D sonar, when you pull up on humps and various things, how much life is in Lake Superior, because it's so big, it's so vast. But what's cool about fishing up there is you don't have to fish very far off a shore because it gets deep very quickly. It's not like Lake Michigan where you got to run out miles to chase down, fish at varying depths. If you want to troll, if you want to jig for lake trout, coho salmon, we've caught a fair amount of cohos, especially early in the season. They're not the big cohos like you get in Lake Michigan, but they're decent size and they're great eating. If you like eating salmon, they're wonderful. But getting out there, what's cool is even if it's a little bit breezy, out of the northwest, something like that, as long as you're fishing the North Shore, you're fine. Or if it's a south wind and you're on that South Shore, you don't have to go very far out. Now, when you're on the South Shore, obviously it tapers a lot better. The North Shore falls off quickly. The South Shore is real flat and gradual. So you got to go out a little bit further. But what's cool on the South Shore is not only are you catching lake trout, salmon, but you're also catching walleyes. And so this whole Lake Superior of me falling in love with again, every chance that we've had over the last month, particularly in August. Every year I tend to take trips in August just because my guide season isn't as rigorous as it is in May, June, and July. I'm not, I could pick days in August or a couple days here and there where I can do trips with my family. We've almost always vacationed somewhere and gone on a fishing vacation in August, whether it be in Alaska or whatever. Well, with this year, with us just kind of refalling in love with Lake Superior and exploring Lake Superior, trolling, casting, jigging, it's been really fun. And we found a lot of water, obviously, as Lake Superior is cold and deep. We've learned a lot about temperature. We've learned a lot about fish locations, movement. This year with the warm summer we've had and not a lot of runoff, Lake Superior is really clear. And without that runoff, it's super clear. But you know what? That South Shore warmed up quickly and the currents are amazing out there. We'll hit an area where, let's say up the North Shore and we found surface temps 41, 42 degrees. We go back a week later and it's been a wind, let's say out of the south or whatever, the currents out of the south. And we'll go to those same areas and surface temps are 55 degrees into that same location. And so that just tells you how much it varies based on wind and current out there. Surface temperatures make a huge deal as far as where the fish are at, where the bait are at, where the herring are at, where the whitefish are at. We've explored all of this. So our ultimate goal was to get up to Isle Royale. And, I've been nervous about it. I'm bringing my son. Yes, I have a big Lund boat, but Lake Superior is a different animal. And I will say one thing, if you're interested in fishing Lake Superior, definitely watch the wind. You want to make sure you're watching the wind, the weather, that you're not going to have a storm come up, something that is going to put you at risk, because that lake is a monster. I mean, look at over the years, just the history of shipping on that lake alone. And when you get out there, you just see the vastness of that lake. It is something that you don't want to mess with. It is bigger than you, and it can get dangerous very quickly. But if you do it right, like we did, we planned this trip to Isle Royale for a couple days. We had 2-3 days built in there that we wanted to fish, but I had more built in on the back end in case it got windy or we couldn't leave Isle Royale or something happened. But not knowing anything about that area, I want to walk you through the steps it takes to fish Isle Royale. First of all, it's Michigan waters. Okay. Even though we launched from Minnesota, as soon as you cross a line there, you hit Michigan waters. And so you have to have a Michigan fishing license. Okay. You've got to have all the Coast Guard approved stuff on your boat. Like, we have the signal flares, the anchor, we've got marine band radio, we have the right life preservers on board. Even though I'm not guiding out there, I wanted to make sure I had everything correct so that when I'm in that particular realm, and really I wanted to have some of this stuff for safety, right? You're traveling out, from Grand Portage to Isle Royale was about 18 to 19 mile run just to the south end. Now the island itself is 50 miles long. And so I wanted to have the proper safety gear. We wore our life vests on the way out there. Even though it was dead flat calm, we picked the ideal days to go. We wanted it when it was like zero wind. We wanted to learn about the island, even though I did some research online. We watched a ton of YouTube videos. We watched people fishing out there. I wanted to make sure I had the proper, I wanted to do it properly, especially with my son on board. And we wanted to explore. We weren't sure if we were going to stay on the island. We weren't sure the protocols. I know the campsites and different things are first come, first serve, but we know we wanted to fish out there. And so we brought all the gear that we could camp out there. We ultimately ended up not camping this trip, but we explored where to go to the ranger station, kind of drove up into that Wendigo Inlet and kind of just explored the south end of Isle Royale, if you will. The other thing that I should touch on, in addition to have Michigan waters and having all this safety equipment, is you got to get a park pass. Okay. You can go online, you can get the national park pass because it is a national park to fish in those waters. If you look on your GPS, like on my Lowrance, there is a border around Isle Royale that kind of lays out, where the park borders are, and it expands out quite far from the island itself. And so when you're out there, you need a park pass, you need Michigan fishing license, all of that stuff. We actually, because we launched out of Grand Portage, and it is Indian reservation, and there are reservation permits that you need to get for fishing those waters. We actually got those permits as well, just because we wanted to be totally legal. We didn't know, we weren't planning on really keeping many fish. I know we wanted to keep one small lake trout to grill out. We wanted to do a camping experience. We ended up camping one night up in Grand Portage. And so, being that we were staying there and we weren't fishing those waters, but we were heading out to Isle Royale, we got the permits anyway. And, it only cost us a few dollars. And we just wanted to be completely legal about everything we did out there. And we just wanted to explore. So we literally got up in the morning. The cool part about where I live, it's not that far to rip up the North Shore. It really isn't. If you live in northern Minnesota, it's a few hours up the North Shore. And I'll tell you, not only have I fallen in love with Lake Superior, but I've really fallen in love with that North Shore once again. I grew up my whole life when the leaves are changing, going up there with my parents, or going up there with my wife when we were dating, or we'd stop at various sites up there, whether it's Castle Danger, Split Rock Lighthouse, Grand Marais, all of the cool things up the North Shore. But now looking at it from the perspective of an angler and being on the water and then looking up at these various landmarks, such a cool thing to do. And it's another thing that I've really just kind of fallen in love with over the last few years, and as a fisherman, even though I get to fish every single day and I guide every day and I go on all these cool experiences, from Lake of the Woods to wherever, Alaska, to have something this special in our own backyard, and even the Great Lakes in general in the Midwest, just being able to have these resources like Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, so on and so forth, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, to have all of these Great Lakes not that far from where we live and our locations is pretty special. The amount of water that we have in our backyard is just amazing. And the fact that we have these kind of fisheries is amazing. So getting out to Isle Royale, we launched dead flat calm. We set a GPS setting. I did a lot of exploring on my maps before I got there. I learned the marina to dump in. I know a lot of people, if they're heading up to Isle Royale, they dump in on up the UP and Upper Michigan, and then they rip out there. It's funny to me. You think of Isle Royale being very close to Minnesota, and it is at Grand Portage. It's, like I said, about 18 miles out there, 19 miles getting to that south end or to the lighthouse out there. But the island itself is 50 miles long. So, you talk about being able to explore some of it. We barely scratched the surface. I mean, to get out to that south end, we literally were just sort of getting our feet wet, if you will. We just wanted to explore like where the ranger station was, how to get to these locations. Even though it's on our map, we wanted to be able to navigate it, make sure there wasn't hazards, what to look out for. When you're on Lake Superior, even though it says very little wind, you can still have swells and different things out there. So we just wanted to learn it for ourselves. And going back to my original statement about forward-facing sonar, I feel more comfortable going to locations like that now, going to locations like I did up at Lake of the Woods, exploring new waters up on Lake of the Woods, because a lot of these locations that you're going to aren't mapped well. Lake Superior is horribly mapped, right? I mean, some of the hazards are marked because of shipping, but really the map is very poor. And it doesn't matter if it's the Lowrance, Hummingbird, Garmin, the maps only get you so far. So being able to get back into these bays and get back into like where the ranger station is and different things, I wanted to see it for myself with forward-facing sonar. I wanted to see these cliff edges, make sure that I'm not going to hit a rock, make sure that I can get back into these areas. Not a whole lot different than when I get up into Canada. You go up to Lake of the Woods and you go to different areas in Canada, the mapping isn't great, right? And the last thing you want to do is hit a rock out in the middle of nowhere. And so for me, putting that forward-facing sonar unit down in the front, where even if I'm using my big trolling motor, what I do is I put that down on my trolling motor, and then I use my remote to kind of scan back and forth as I idle through areas that I'm unsure of. Okay, this is a great bit of advice for you. Even if you're going on vacation to a lake where you're unsure of what's out there, you're not sure if the map's correct, you're not sure how the rocks are laid out, or a season like we have this year where the water is really low, right? And maps aren't correct. Putting that forward-facing sonar unit down, whether it's on your trolling motor, you could have it on a bundle, like an ice bundle on an arm, like I use a lot, putting the actual arm down. You can scan with that as you're idling forward. That's going to help you determine any of these hazard areas. Plus, it helps you map out the area a lot better in your mind. So even if you're going to fish those areas, having that forward-facing sonar unit down is cool. And it's, so I'm not using it as a fish finding tool in this sense. I'm using it as a safety protocol. And so as we left Grand Portage, it's really shallow in the bay there. I was just kind of looking to make sure there was no rocks, anything I could hit because the water's down, even on Lake Superior. As we got out towards the island and as we got closer, even though some of the shallow water spots seemed to be marked very well on the graph, I just wanted to make sure. And so I got up there, we kind of explored. We found a ton of cool stuff. We actually heard wolves howling on the island, which was really neat. And we explored basically the south end. We spent 2 days. We camped overnight in Grand Portage. We ended up going back and forth both days. Hindsight, after kind of exploring it, I would have just stayed on the island. But it leaves room for next year where when we go out there, I want to pick a time frame that is almost identical to what we just had as far as very little wind, great visibility. And I want to take a couple of friends with, so we have multiple boats to go out there next time and camp on the island. That is our goal next, to just get up there, camp on the island, and spend some time out there. What's really cool about being out there was I thought the surface temperature was going to be a lot cooler where we were at on the south end. And it might be now today. You never know what the currents. But when we were there, surface temps were almost 55 degrees. So it seemed like a lot of the trout had slipped off the edges of the reefs. They were hanging on those, sharp breaks, kind of where that thermocline must change down there and the temperature change versus up on top, because we've had a lot of times where, the trout will be right up on top of these humps when that water temp's cool. They're up there feeding and moving around. As warm as it was, a lot of these fish had slipped off the edge, kind of in that secondary range. A lot of them weren't super deep, but just catching those big redfin trout, they are a special species. And if you're unfamiliar with lake trout in general, look up the redfins. They're the big native trout that are local to that area, to Lake Superior, and they are such a cool fish. The fish that I'm going to post for this social media post for this podcast is a big redfin that I caught. It's one of the bigger ones that I've ever caught as far as a redfin species, and it's just magnificent. The fish itself is beautiful. Trout, if you're familiar with lake trout fishing, some of them are really gnarred up. Some of them have, big scars from either lampreys or whatever. They're kind of bruisers, right? They're kind of hardy. What's cool about fishing lake trout is, they sort of burp up their air so you can catch them a little bit deeper. If you're talking catching a walleye in 50, 60, 70, 80 feet of water, they're pretty much dead. Most fish species are dead. Lake trout, they can burp up their air. And so they're burping up their air on these humps, and you're seeing how magnificent these fish are. Robbie and I's goal to go out there was to explore Isle Royale, to explore the humps and kind of get a feel of the lay of the land so we can do a trip up there with friends, with buddies, whatever in the future, and just explore Isle Royale. It's a bucket list trip. I've lived in Minnesota my whole life, and it's sad to say that I've never been out to Isle Royale. I think a lot of people would say that because when we got out there, I couldn't believe how little humans we saw. We saw a couple ferries go through. We saw a couple charters go by. That was about it. And it was a dead flat, calm, beautiful, day, Thursday, Friday, whatever day we went up there. And so seeing that little of traffic up there was amazing to me. And to see that vast wilderness of a 50-mile island, beautiful. But having said that, the reason we went up there was to explore, catch a few fish. And I will say, if you want to explore fishing Lake Superior in general, I highly recommend that. And I don't mean to sound like I'm preaching, but these lake trout grow really, really slow. And so the release of these bigger lake trout in general, I highly recommend it. A big fish like this takes, 20, 30, 40 years to grow. You can look at the records of where they've, tagged some of these fish and these capture and release. I know Ethan Watashek has done a few things on social media as far as, some of the big fish that he's caught that have been tagged and then captured and released. And they'll give you data based on, where they tag this fish, how old this fish is. Some of these fish are 30, 40, 50 years old, which is amazing to see. It's kind of like lake sturgeon fishing. They grow and they live to amazing ages. And so because these fish are so special, we didn't want to keep any fish unless it, was bleeding or something weird. So we ended up keeping 2 small trout, got a couple smaller ones, one small redfin, and then just one other lake trout we caught. We were fishing with spoons, and it just, with that treble hook or whatever, it got hooked weird. And it was bleeding. So we put it on ice, and had that fish for dinner. Amazing. Fresh lake trout over a grill when you're camping with your son. Amazing, amazing experience. So I'm not against, the family fish fry. I'm not against keeping any fish. It's just these great big lake trout up there are super special. And so I hope if people are going out there jigging, if they're going out there trolling, whatever, that they are very mindful of just how special these fish actually are. But what's cool about getting up there is we had no idea if the fishing was going to be amazing, if it was going to be slow. We didn't know what we'd encounter. We had kind of geeked out over a bunch of maps, but it was fun. I wouldn't say that it was one after another, but it was pretty consistent fishing of catching really big lake trout. It was harder to catch the smaller ones. We actually ended up going up pretty shallow to catch some smaller lake trout that we could actually eat. Like I said, the one was a smaller redfin we caught shallow. And then one that got hooked weird. That was shallow. We were casting at, some fish up shallow. We weren't sure if they were rainbows or brook trout. This lake trout came out of nowhere and hit my son's spoon. So pretty cool to see these fish. But most of the trout that we caught on the humps, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-foot humps, they were all bigger trout. And they were running in packs of 3s, 4s, 5s, and they were really aggressive. You drop your jig down there, you drop your plastic down there, they would crack it. It seemed like anything you put in front of them, that water is super clear. They can see it, they can hit it. Even when you're trolling, you can watch your baits and you can watch these fish that are down deep and come up, 30, 40 feet to hit your bait. I mean, that's how clear Lake Superior is. And so you also have to be mindful when you're fishing out there that you don't get too close to your fish. And I can see why guys over the years, and it goes back to the forward-facing sonar conversation, I can see why over the years people use boards, trolling boards, to get baits away from the boats, because it's amazing when we get close to salmon, when we get close to lake trout that are, let's say, 20, 30 feet down, it's amazing the spook factor on Lake Superior when you get close to them with your boat. You'll be 60, 70 feet from fish sometimes that are only 20, 30, 40 feet down, and they spook. And so I could see why over the years, trollers relied on having a big spread of boards, getting those baits out way away from the boat, and they catch way more fish. Obviously, seeing it now with our own eyes with forward-facing sonar, pretty cool. But if anybody has, any inkling to get up to Lake Superior, to get up to Isle Royale, whether it be, our next adventure, we want to go over and explore more of the South Shore into the Apostle Islands. We want to do more exploring on Lake Superior. Now's the time to do it. I can't believe just the biomass of fish out there. First of all, the fishing's actually pretty good. I mean, there are a lot of areas where there's nothing, right? It's Lake Superior. There's big vastness, and it's interesting how, these fish really migrate from location to location throughout the year, whether it be salmon, cruising up the North Shore, back down to the South Shore towards winter, or these lake trout migrations. We're just now scratching the surface, but being able to get out to Isle Royale and experience it with my son in a boat, and now knowing what we do next time we go up there, I'm for sure going to stay on the island. And if you want any information about that, go online. You can look up Isle Royale. You can look up times to do it. For me personally, I've always loved August for exploring different areas, especially like the Great Lakes. And I know August isn't probably the most ideal time to fish, but it is one of the calmer times to fish. And so for the Great Lakes, for me, I do like getting up there in August. We did some last year in August. We're going to do some more before the month's over, before my son goes back to school. But getting up there in August is ideal because it's calm. And I can go out there with my Lund Pro V, feel completely comfortable, and go explore. And in addition to the fishing, I should say, even up the North Shore itself, just the landmarks, seeing them from a boat and looking up at these landmarks is unbelievable. And, I've seen them my whole life from shore looking out into Lake Superior, but being out there looking up at some of these landmarks, especially up the North Shore, pretty amazing, pretty breathtaking. And it gives you a whole different perspective about the lake. It gives you respect for the lake. It's just a very cool experience. So I wanted to share that with you on this podcast. Hey, we're going to take a break. When I come back, let's talk some walleye fishing. Let's talk some panfish. I know the kids are getting ready to go back to school. You might have some last minute plans to rip up north. I'm going to tell you about the locations where I'm finding fish, where I'm catching fish, and how to do so. So stay tuned. We got more Dialed In Angling after this. Arneson's Rocky Point Resort in northern Minnesota offers a little something for everyone. Nestled on Lake of the Woods South Shore, it provides easy access to 14 remarkable reefs. Serious anglers know that Arneson's offers some of the best fishing, charter fishing, and small boat fishing options, all supported by the largest protected marina on the lake's South Shore. Accommodation selections range from 1 to 5 bedrooms. Equipped with all the modern conveniences, guests can enjoy a delightful dining experience and stunning lake views at the Rock Harbor Lodge, an on-site, full-service bar and restaurant. The two beaches provide hours of fun for the whole family. Whether you're seeking an idyllic fishing spot or a relaxing vacation, Arneson's Rocky Point has everything you need. Check them out at arnesonsresort.com. OnX Fish is the best tool I have ever used for finding new lakes to target. Quickly filter lakes by species, then select trophy potential, high abundance, keeper potential, or high stocking effort to find the fish you are after in the size and the numbers you are trying to catch. Download from the App Store today to get research tools for the serious anglers and beginners alike, giving you the data to target the right lakes and the confidence to get there. Use tools like recent imagery, fishing hotspot data, or the best-in-class weather features that call out current wind, weather, barometer, moon phase, majors and minors, along with precip and more. OnX Fish is a phenomenal tool both on and off the water for discovering new fishing opportunities, many of which you'd never known existed. Download OnX Fish Midwest today, the app that is changing the game on ice and open water. All right, so let's get into some talk about walleye locations, panfish locations. I know a lot of people are going to take advantage of the last few weeks of getting up north, doing some fishing before their kids have to go back to school, whether you're going to, your cabin lake or whatever. I've been doing some walleye fishing the last few weeks. I've been doing some pan fishing with the water temps cooling off. Things are changing a bit. It's really good to see this cool down of the water. I don't know if you've followed the news lately, but lots of talk of fish kills in southern Minnesota and all these things because of rising surface temperatures, which can happen when we have a warm summer like we had. And really, I wouldn't even say we had a warm summer. We literally had a warm July, and in northern Minnesota, it wasn't as bad as some other locations. But, some of those nighttime lows when they're only in the 70s, it was close to 90 for a stretch there. Things heat up, especially when you don't have rain. I think it gets compiled a lot worse on years that you have drought years, just because you don't have that rain cooling off those surface temperatures day in and day out. Certainly on Mille Lacs, if you follow social media, there was some tullaby die-off, a little bit of walleyes. I wouldn't say it was as widespread as I've seen in some years, but certainly when the surface temps started rising, mostly of what you saw as far as fish kill were tullabies, ciscos that were high in the water column. It coincided with a little midge hatch that we had, and so a lot of these fish were up high feeding. And when that happens, when the water's warm, they just start popping up like popcorn. I remember, back in the day, a few of the big muskie trollers back in the day when they would troll, they always said, in August when the tullabies start dying off, those muskies are up at the surface feeding on tullabies, and that was the time to be out there. And that was definitely the case during that warm stretch. We're not seeing that anymore. As a matter of fact, it's interesting because the water warmed up so much. We had algae blooms and different things that Mille Lacs is really dirty right now. A lot of the lakes that I've been fishing, you see they've dirtied up, and a lot of it has to do with the algae blooms. Some of the vegetation starting to die off. You're getting into those time frames where just the water is a little bit murky and dingy. Before I get into some walleye talk, I want to talk pan fishing because I'm super passionate about pan fishing. I did a couple trips this week with friends. I did a trip with my Uncle Gary, my dad, and Robbie. And I want to tell a story about, kind of in my head as you get into August. A lot of times, crappies in particular can be out on the edges of wintering basins. And really, as vegetation starts to die off in the fall, you'll see this vast movement of fish out of the weed lines, out into the edge of the basins, and you can see them, especially with forward-facing sonar. It's easy to hunt them down, and it becomes really good fishing, even with 2D sonar and even with just blind casting power fishing. One of my favorite times to fish is fall, no doubt about it, but even leading up to fall, if you get a year like we've had this year and you get some of that vegetation that starts to die off, these fish will pull off the weed lines pretty quickly. And they're seeking out cooler water. They're seeking out different oxygen levels. As those plants start to decay, they give off carbon dioxide. So those fish start to pull out of there. And that's when you can really have fun fishing. You can have a great multi-species event. And so going out with my Uncle Gary the other day, we went to a particular lake that I love fishing panfish. I love fishing crappies. It doesn't have a real distinct weed line, but it is warmer like a lot of lakes. So going into that scenario, I thought, all right, well, we're going to start checking the edges of these wintering basins, not very deep, 15 to 20 feet. The particular lake I was fishing had a thermocline, so most of the fish were above 20 feet anyway. So it wasn't like I was chasing fish out in deep water, but we were out looking for crappies, and I thought they'd be in the basin. And this lake we were fishing is fairly decent size, and it has a lot of basins, and it has a lot of edges where fish would hang, right? And so we're looking and looking and looking. We found a few small pods, and we caught a few decent ones, but they just weren't there yet. And so, by the time you sort of go down that rabbit hole, looking, you realize that they're not there. And so, we caught some fish. We caught some shallow. We caught some on the edge of the wintering basin, but they were kind of scattered out. Same thing can be said. Fast forward a couple days, I had a buddy with his kids. We were taking out fishing. We were going to do and catch some bluegills. The kids wanted to have a little fish fry, but they mainly just wanted to catch fish and have a good time doing it. When you have a bunch of kids on the boat, you want them to catch fish as quickly as possible. So ideal scenario is either taking them perch fishing or taking them bluegill fishing. And we slipped into the edges of these weeds, and I was checking kind of that outside weed edge, the basin. The fish weren't there yet. They were still in the weeds. And we ended up catching them in the weeds in big numbers in the deeper cabbage, but they're there. So the point of my story is twofold. One, even though I expected to find them out in the wintering basin, they weren't there. So I had to shift gears and kind of fish where the fish were, if you will. I love it when they pull off the weed line a little bit. You can power fish through them with plastics, with jigging wraps, crankbaits, jerk baits for that matter, and catch them pretty regularly. Spinners, whatever you want to throw at them. The other thing is you can see them. A lot of times, even with forward-facing sonar, when they're hunkered down in that deep cabbage, it's really hard to see them down there. Unless you have little pockets in the weeds, it's really hard to see them. Even, because this time of year with the cabbage, you've got some of that sandgrass, you have eel grass and all the grasses that kind of grow up in between the cabbage. Those crappies and those bluegills are hunkering down in the shade of that stuff. So they're way down there. You see it on milfoil lakes too, where they'll hunker in the milfoil and they don't really start pulling out of that milfoil till you get that die off. And so, the point of my story is one, I wanted to catch them in the basin. I searched for them in the basin. They weren't quite there yet. Not to say that not all the lakes out there. I just assumed with the warm weather, because I haven't been fishing panfish that much. And not to say that all lakes, there's not going to be any fish in the wintering basins, because we're getting to that time period when they're going to start pulling out to those areas. But the vegetation was in really good shape, and most of those fish were hunkered down up in there, and you had to fish plastics. And here's how I went about catching them. Twofold. One, drop shots. If you've ever drop shotted for panfish, or if you've never drop shotted for panfish, this is kind of my drop shot setup, right? I use about 1.5 leader. I like to use the VMC cylinder drop shots. You can use any drop shot you want. But what drop shots do for you is you can punch down in through the vegetation and you can get your presentation down into them. Now, you can use live bait, you can use plastics. Either one works great. I've even tied hair jigs on and used like a hair jig with the drop shot. But most of the time, I'm just using a plain hook, like a small octopus hook, like a number 6, a number 8, and then punching that drop shot through the vegetation into the fish. Now, if you're fishing bluegills, really small leeches work great. If you want to use live bait, I prefer to use plastics where I can. I like a straight tail plastic. You can tip that on a really small hook. Even like a straight Aberdeen hook works sometimes too, where you put a straight plastic on the edge of that thing, and you can shake that bait. I would say my favorite or my go-to would be some sort of straight tail plastic. Now, Crush City has the new little crushers that have come out. I've been fishing them extensively. You'll see these little crusher baits next year. So if you love the Crush City baits, You're going to love the Crush City Little Crushers for panfish, for finesse fishing. They have a couple different straight tail plastics in there. But one freeloader that I use a lot, it's the same profile as the freeloader that we use for walleye fishing, for bass, for lake trout, but that freeloader design, they have that. Also the Mooch Minnow. Those are my two go-tos in that lineup in the little crushers. They're great on a drop shot, but they're also great if you're using a little bit heavier jig. And so for the crappies, I tend to use a jig with a straight tail plastic. For the bluegills, I tend to use a drop shot either with the plastic or the live bait. And again, if I'm going to use live bait, for me, it's going to be those little tiny panfish leeches. Bluegills can't resist them. But as far as the straight tail plastic, if you're going to fish them on a jig, I typically will fish on a 16th ounce jig. But if I want to punch into some of that deeper cabbage, I'll upsize to an 1/8 ounce, like an 1/8 ounce Moon Eye with that little crusher on there. And I could get that down in those cabbage pockets. And, if you're fishing a lake that's really clear, you don't need forward-facing sonar or even sonar for that matter. You just need to look around for that tall standing stock cabbage on the edges, okay? And what I look for is when it heads out and you can see the heads of the cabbage weeds sticking out, get right to the edges and try to dump into the pockets. That's where you're going to find the majority of your fish, the majority of your big fish. And where drop shots and heavier jig heads are really your best friend is you can get it past those small bluegills. The small bluegills, the small panfish, the small little bass, they tend to hang up in the water column. If you can dump something down quickly down into that heavier cabbage, you're going to catch the bigger panfish. You're going to catch the bigger bluegills. You're going to catch the bigger crappies. And then, of course, you're also going to get some bycatch with some bass down in there. Lots of largemouth lurking around wherever you have those species. And so that's kind of my panfish story. Did not find the fish on the edges of the basin, but more so found them in that thicker cabbage in where there's cover, there's shade, there's a temperature difference there. As things start cooling off here and as more and more vegetation starts to die off, you will see these fish pull out to the edges. And again, that's probably my favorite time of year to fish. Other than springtime pan fishing is when they start to pull off a little bit before they go out into those deeper basins, but they're kind of right on the edge. So they're on the edge of the weed lines, but they're not in the deep water yet. You can cast, you can power fish. It's really fun. It's kind of like this reemergence like you have in the spring. One of my favorite things to do in the spring for panfish is to throw jerk baits and to throw plastics, not just bobber fish. I like bobber fishing right away when the ice goes out. It's kind of cool to see a float go down. I love that time period. But shortly after that, when I'm able to cast to fish, I love it. And that's what I love about pan fishing is like going to different areas and not only catching big panfish, but catching numbers of good panfish and really targeting them in the sense where you're patterning these fish. And when you can pattern them, when they pull off those weed lines, you see everything. And it's amazing how you'll go to a lake right now when they're hunkered down in the weeds. You don't see that many usually on your forward-facing sonar unit. Even with me, like I'm really good at seeing fish in the weeds. It's hard to see them when they're way down in there. It really is. You don't see those schools of crappies until you start catching them. And so when they start to pull off, you realize how many are in a lake or in a system or are relating to that particular weed line. And what's cool too is like, you'll see them pull off these weed lines and you're like, oh, cool. Well, I tend to go up and explore what kind of vegetation they're relating to because that next summer when you go to those lakes or that location, you'll be like, okay, they're relating to this particular deep cabbage bed. Crappies in particular, but even big bluegills, I think they like that big leafy cabbage. It gives it a lot of shade, a lot of cover, but it also gives them pockets to hide in down below and stay away from predator fish like pike and bass and that sort of thing. What's cool right now, too, for me, as far as pan fishing the last few days with kids, I'm not getting bit off by as many pike. And I think it's because the water's warm and those pike have pulled out into cooler water. Pike especially big pike, they like cooler water scenarios. And so drop shotting in there, you're not getting bit off as much. I think we only lost maybe one hook or one plastic to a pike. You're getting a few bass, which is always fun on light gear. And then you're just targeting those bigger panfish because you're able to get those baits down into those pockets and stay away from the small ones. So That's what I would do if you're coming up doing a little pan fishing on your local lake. I would start and look for those deeper cabbage pockets. You can start on humps. You can start on weed edges, on sharp breaks, anywhere where you have that deeper cabbage where it dumps out into deeper water. That's what I would start looking for them. As far as walleyes, I've been doing some walleye fishing on small lakes, but I've also done some on Mille Lacs. And it's interesting because even though the water got really warm, kind of the same scenario I'm finding on the smaller lakes for the walleyes is the walleyes are really up into the weeds. They're thick in the vegetation. Some of the mid-lake humps where you typically find walleyes starting to skirt off the edge, I'm just not quite seeing it yet. Most of these fish where I'm catching them on the small lakes that I fished a couple different small lakes. The walleyes were heavily relating to the weed lines. I'm catching them with mooch minnows. I'm catching them with jig crawlers, but I'm also using slip bobbers. Now, slip bobbers and crawlers, slip bobbers and leeches, and then pinpointing those fish in there. Now, I would say one big suggestion I could give to you as far as pinpointing walleyes in vegetation is, again, kind of like I was talking about earlier, as far as staying away from the fish and not spooking them. It's hard to do when you're fishing vegetation because when you're creeping around the weeds, you have to get the right angle to see those fish sometimes, especially really thick vegetation. You have to get up a little bit tighter than you would if they're just out in open water scenarios, because sometimes that big, thick cabbage, like earlier in the year when they relate to the weed lines, you can still see them in there. When you get a really thick weed line, like on a clear lake where, let's say, the weeds go out to 25, 26 feet of water and they're up in the weeds, you have to see them. And so what my recommendation would be to you, and what I do almost daily, is I start deep and I shoot up shallow, okay? And then I shift my boat and I come on the inside edge of the weed line and I shoot out deep. If you follow Target Walleye at all, Brett McComas was talking about positioning your boat shallow and pitching to deep fish on weed lines. I do that all the time guiding when I'm looking for fish and even fishing for them. But I'll start deep, cast shallow, and then I'll work on the inside edge of the weed lines and shoot my way out. That way you get like kind of a 360 view of the fish with forward-facing sonar, or if you're using side imaging, or even if you're just power fishing through areas where you're not using your electronics to find them, you're just dumping on pockets of fish. If you keep your boat out a little bit deeper and not spook those fish, you're going to catch more. Another thing that I like to use in addition to live bait or even swimming minnows is just your classic jig and plastic or hair jig in the weeds this time of year. And I typically will use a little bit heavier jig, and I like to use a fluorocarbon fluorocarbon leader, just because there's a lot of pike. And then I use a braided line. What I do is I throw it up in the cabbage. I let it go down towards the bottom. And before it hits the bottom or gets into that kind of sandgrassy, mossy stuff, I'll snap it and let it fall. Crush City plastics work great. Paddle tails are fantastic most of the year. But for this time of year, I tend to use a straight tail plastic or a minnow profile. So the jerk, if you look at the Crush City jerk profile, that minnow profile style, or even a freeloader or a mooch minnow rather than a paddle tail, what I like about that is it darts around a lot more. There's a lot more action to the bait. It moves a lot more, whereas the paddle tail, if I'm snapping baits anyway, is more of a rise, slower fall. Rise, slower fall. I want a quick bait that's going to snap through that cabbage, and those walleyes have to react to it. Another thing that you can do to put walleyes in the boat is trolling this time of year, trolling the outside edges in the mornings and evenings, or trolling the inside edges with like shallow running shad wraps, things like that. Jerk baits work great for casting, or else just pulling spinners over the tops of the weeds with a small split shot, about a 3-foot leader, a gold or silver spinner with a night crawler or a small minnow. A rainbow minnow works great too, if there's a ton of bluegills and that sort of thing. But then just targeting those fish in the weeds. And so that's kind of my go-to on the small lakes. On Mille Lacs, I've been doing a lot more snapping plastics, but mainly bobber fishing. I've noticed Mille Lacs has gotten, and if you've been out of Mille Lacs the last few weeks, it's gotten really, really dirty. And so presenting a fish on a bobber, not even a jig crawler, not even a mooch minnow, not even a plastic, but presenting a bobber right in front of their face and like dumping it right on their face because the water has gotten so dark, it seems like I'm catching more fish during the day with bobbers. If I'm snapping plastics in shallow water, what I do is I use a brighter plastic right now. I throw it out there. I let it fall right in front of their face and then sit on the bottom. Again, using the Crush City Jerk with a 1/4 ounce moon eye, really bright colors. The bright UV colors work great, but positioning that bait right in front of that fish and letting it sit there. And then rather than doing big rips like you normally do in the spring and fall, smart, short little pops with those baits. You can do it with the Ned rigs. Ned rigs are working great. They catch walleyes all over the place. But rather than doing big snaps like you would to catch walleyes typically with the Neds, it's small little pops. So you pop up and then just let it sit there. What's cool about the Crush City baits is they're buoyant, and so that bait's going to sit upright. That jerk is just going to sit up there like a defensive crayfish or like a dead minnow on the bottom. But brighter colors, snapping those. If that's not working, break out the floats. Put the bobbers with the baits right in front of the fish's face, and you're going to catch more fish. So good luck to everybody, as always. Thanks for tuning in to this week's Dialed In Angling podcast. Hopefully I gave you some insight into Isle Royale. I know I'm going to do a lot more exploring up there. I'm going to do a lot more exploring on Lake Superior, but also Lake Michigan. I want to get over to Lake Michigan, because we've been doing a lot of casting for salmon, for lake trout. It's really kind of triggered this passion for chasing those species of fish, just because they move fast, they're aggressive, they fight like crazy, and they're really fun to catch. You can catch them on a wide variety of baits, from plastics to spoons to whatever, to flies. And so I'm just really getting into it right now. My son's getting into it. So hopefully I gave you some insight on Lake Superior. I'll have more. I know next year we want to do a full-on podcast and trip up on Isle Royale. That will be on my list for next year for sure. August is one of those time periods which you can do it. It's pretty calm out there. So if you've ever wanted to explore that. And then, of course, enjoy the next few weeks before the kids go back to school. Summer goes fast. It's unbelievable that we're already talking about back to school. We're talking about the Minnesota State Fair, all of that stuff. It's crazy that summer goes by this quickly. So take advantage of it when you can. Once again, thanks for tuning into the podcast. As always, I'm Tony Roach, and this has been the Dialed In Angling Podcast. Good luck fishing.